congregation to share on this topic here over these weeks. Very grateful for the Georgetown College students who are here. Friend Dr. Homer White, thank you for coming out tonight, and others. It's really a blessing to be here in the beautiful evening that we have. When Pastor William invited me to share tonight, I wrestled a little bit with whether this would be more of a kind of testimony of my journey with the LGBTQ inclusion question and what that's been like, that conversation over the last 15 or so years, or more of like a theological, biblical kind of basis of where I am on that conversation now. And so as I went back and forth on that, it felt a little incomplete to me to do either one without any of the other. So in the next 20 minutes here, I'm going to try my best to get both of those in there. So I'll jump right in, just kind of share about my early life, and I could relate with what Pastor William said a few weeks ago. In my early life, I don't remember a whole lot of having dialogues. I mean, there wasn't like dialogues like this. I don't remember LGBTQ questions. I don't remember it coming up at home, hardly, or in church, or in schools, really. I don't really remember, have memories of that. I did grow up a little bit in church. Some, and then for a few years, not so much. The one thing that I do remember, though, is that I do remember that some folks, hearing and kind of picking up on this idea that being gay was wrong or immoral, and I never understood that. Like, I wasn't getting that at home, but I remember picking up on that from some other people, and I never really, to me, I really struggled with that. I never really understood why people believe that. So I became a Christian in 9th grade, and again, that wasn't really a topic that was talked about in church. I rejected Christianity in 10th grade, and a year later, and I didn't really have a relationship with any gay people growing up, or at least that I knew of, in middle school or high school, and not even really in college either. So at the end of my senior year in college, I resurrendered my life to Jesus. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I thought it'd be cool to study Christianity more and try to figure things out. So I entered into seminary after a year a year after I graduated undergrad. I started seminary. And I started, at the time, although most of my faith formation growing up was in the Baptist church, after having not considered myself to be a Christian for a number of years, when I started at seminary, I just called myself non-denominational. I'm just a Christian, and that's all. And so about a year later, though, I decided to join the Episcopal Church, and I was confirmed into the Episcopal Church on the evening of September 11th, 2001. That evening was our confirmation, adult confirmation. I knew Episcopalians were more accepting of LGBTQ folks, including pastors, and I was good with that. LGBTQ inclusion was not my primary motivation for becoming an Episcopalian at the time, but it was one of many ways that it seemed like the Episcopal Church was a good fit for me back then. A year later, in 2002, I joined the United Methodist Church for a couple of reasons. One was really super practical. I went to Duke Divinity School, and because of the old Duke family big tobacco money, which funded the Duke Endowment, I guess they were Methodists, the United Methodist field placement, their internships paid about 4 times more than the internship I would have gotten at the Episcopal Church. Being a third-year graduate student who had worked all of the previous summer in an unpaid internship, as a hospital chaplain at NYU Hospital, a higher paid internship that next year was very appealing. But bigger than that, the main reason I became a United Methodist was because besides Amanda and our friend Scott Bullard, who's a Baptist, most of my other seminary classmates, whom I wanted to be my comrades in ministry moving forward, most of them were United Methodists. And so I felt loved into the United Methodist Church by them. Theologically, the United Methodist Church was an okay fit, but not a perfect fit for me, who most of my formation had been kind of Baptist and Episcopalian. The Methodist Church's roots were in the Church of England with a dose of Moravian pietist influence. I did wrestle, though, with the Methodist Church's teachings on LGBTQ. Their teachings seemed to me to be more humane than some other denominations, in that the official teaching of the church is that gay folks are persons of sacred worth who are deeply loved by God, but nevertheless, same-sex relationships were considered to be incompatible with Christian scripture, is the language. So 20 years ago at the time, that seemed to me to be a more conservative stance that though was kind of a middle road between the churches that seemed to demonize gay folks, which I didn't want to be a part of that, and churches that were fully inclusive of LGBTQ folks. So even though I wasn't fully on board with the Methodist Church's teachings on LGBTQ, I nevertheless decided to join the Methodist Church and started the process of becoming a pastor, a Methodist pastor. Part of my rationale at the time was that I had done enough church shopping to know that there is no perfect denomination. And so there's no perfect church. And I'd probably never find a denomination that taught everything that I believed just the way I believed it. And the second part of that, though, was that my seminary training taught me that the teachings of the church and the gospel will and should call into question some of my beliefs. The idea being that I am not God, and that my own natural beliefs and biases are not the gospel, and that they are in need of redemption. So I entered this season of tension where I was seeking to become a United Methodist pastor, even though I struggled with this Methodist teaching. I was also trained in a seminary that as a pastor, my primary job was to teach what the church teaches, rather than my own individual beliefs. But how would I do that when I was never comfortable teaching what the Methodist Church taught on this? So I had a good friend in seminary whose name was Rob, and he was one of these people. He was a Cradle United Methodist, and I just remember he was like the guy. Like when I grew up, I wanted to be a pastor like this guy. Like once I felt that call to ministry, I remember seeing a video, it was a VHS back then, a video of him preaching this sermon at this church internship before we even took a preaching class, and he didn't use any notes, and I was amazed by this guy. He did hospital chaplaincy we were together up in New York City that summer of 2001. I remember after we graduated, he went back to Mississippi and was a pastor of a church there. Very fruitful ministry. I'd see articles that the ministry of his church was being lifted up in the local newspapers, and so much fruit from his ministry. Well, one day while we were in seminary, almost towards the end of right before third year started, we had lunch on a park bench. It was actually up in New York City, and he told me that he was gay. And I've shared this in a sermon once before. Some of you may remember this. And so, we talked about that. He went on, like I said, once we graduated, he went on to Mississippi. And so as I was struggling a little bit with this question of, well, how should I stay United Methodist or not? I figured that as long as Rob, who's gay, was a Methodist pastor, as long as he stuck with it, I could probably stick with it too. And so he did. He stuck with it for a while, celibate, and then he fell in love. And after several years, it kind of dawned. He figured out he either needed to turn in his credentials as a Methodist pastor, or not pursue this relationship with this man he'd fallen in love with. And so, I'm talking to him as he's on that journey, and he ultimately leaves the church and joins a Baptist church down in Jackson, Mississippi. Which is great. He's found a home there. So during this time, I ended up more or less on a path of continuing to listen and to pray and to study and to discern on this topic for a number of years. Individually, I ministered with LGBTQ folks as I encountered them, and tried my best personally, again, usually on campus, to create safe space for them. Serving in a chaplain role at a college has been a really helpful context to do that. In a chaplain role, a college is not a church. And so there's never really been a lot of pressure on me to teach certain doctrines as the campus minister. Like a chaplain in a hospital or like a military chaplain, like their job's not really so much to teach doctrine to folks as it is to kind of walk with them through kind of the ups and downs of, whether they're in the service or in the hospital or on campus. So it's been my great joy to be able to walk with students, gay students, straight students, all different kinds of students over these years at Georgetown College. During the season, I brought my friend Rob from Mississippi up to campus, at that time he's out and he's kind of sharing. He worked for the Human Rights Campaign at that point, but he was talking about his journey as a gay man, kind of going through and what that was like for him, being a pastor and then not being a pastor and how painful that was. I joined up with Georgetown Fairness and attended some meetings and a few rallies for fairness policy and ordinance on campus and in Georgetown overall. I once shared the stage on campus with Bob Fox and with an Episcopalian priest from Lexington, and I believe one other pastor as well. We were asked to share what our denomination teaches on the topic of LGBTQ inclusion. And this was around the time when Georgetown Fairness Campaign was kicking off, and I did that. I shared what the United Methodist Church taught and a few of my thoughts around that subject then. During this time, I also learned that one of my colleagues in campus ministry is gay. This person told me that near the end of their time on staff with us. This person had been an amazing colleague who had a really fruitful ministry on campus, and I was sad to see them leave for another job. So that's kind of some of the testimony, kind of my journey over those last 15 years. I'd like to close with just a little bit more of kind of where I am today and how that connects with the kind of theological basis or biblical basis lens that I'm looking at that through today. So today I am for full LGBT inclusion in the life of the church, and here are a few reasons why, and a few things that I've been learning over the past few years as I've had conversations with gay folks and straight folks, with conservative folks and progressive folks, and with guys and gals and non-binary pals. So a few things that I've learned. Becoming a student of the civil rights movement over these past 13 years has helped tremendously for me. I see parallels between the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century and the movement for LGBTQ rights over these past few decades. I learned from MLK, for example, how he became more frustrated with white moderates than he was with the KKK. And the reason why is because it was the white moderate church leaders who would always say to him that they agreed with him on civil rights in principle, but that when they would object to the protests and demonstrations that he led, arguing that he needed to be more patient and that he needed to give white folks as a whole more time to come around on civil rights. And of course, MLK's famous response is, "The time is always right to do what is right." I've been reminded that sometimes the church gets things wrong. And as pastoral leaders, it's our job to stand up and speak out when that's the case. Another key thing I've always thought, and that I've become increasingly convinced of, though, over these past few years, is the truth that, first, as David Gushee puts it, gay people exist. That gay people are not just confused heterosexuals, that gay folks don't choose who they are attracted to any more than I do or that I did. I don't ever remember during adolescence deciding that I was going to be attracted to females. My experience has been that sexual attraction is one of those things that happens to us rather than us choosing whom we are attracted to. We decide what we do with the attraction that we experience, but my experience at least has been we don't choose to whom we're attracted. Secondly, I've learned that there is just as much diversity among gay folks as there is among heterosexuals. So it just doesn't make sense to talk about a gay lifestyle because there's thousands of different ways of being gay, just as there are thousands of different ways of being heterosexual. And there's, I'm sure, hundreds of different ways of being gay and Christian, and I'm just learning more about those. For too long, I believe the church has treated gay folks as if they are confused heterosexuals, and since most churches have refused to bless same-sex relationships, I think for me it's been helpful to think through, so what's the church's guidance been then for those who are gay? What's been the guidance? Well, one thing has been the church has sometimes recommended things like so-called conversion therapy, which that method has been discredited by medical professionals, and even by Alan Chambers, the guy who started Exodus International, one of the most well-known so-called ex-gay ministries. that advocated for conversion therapy. In 2013, he apologized to the LGBTQ community for the pain and hurt that Exodus had caused, and he repented of his work with Exodus. So again, I don't believe conversion therapy is a viable option even for conservative churches on this moving forward. And I've had conversations with folks who are in conservative churches, some of my United Methodist brothers and sisters. One campus minister, for example, who's conservative on this question, and we had conversation, and I asked him his thoughts on it, and he said, for me, I believe the scriptures say that same-sex relationships are wrong. He said, and I just can't get around that. He said, I wish it said something different. He said, I wish it said something different. So those are some of the kinds of conversations I've been having with people, and it's really helpful to hear other points of view. Second option I think some churches have done that won't bless same-sex relationships is just encourage Christians to remain celibate and single all of their lives. This seems to me to be unfair. Remember, Jesus was single and celibate. Paul, single and celibate, as far as we know. Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 7-9 that he wishes that all Christians would be single as he is, but that if you can't control your lust, then it's better to get married than to burn with passion. So one could argue that heterosexual marriages are not the ideal in Christianity, but rather heterosexual marriages are a kind of accommodation from the ideal. So to me, if the church is going to be teaching that singleness and celibacy is the way to go, as some churches have done in the past, and there's good biblical basis for doing that, but then that call for singleness and celibacy should be for both heterosexuals and gay folks. Singling gay Christians out for mandatory celibacy seems discriminatory. Third option, sometimes I've heard churches just kind of be real quiet around this and not really say anything, and just basically encourage folks who are gay to marry a straight person. I guess kind of hoping that would kind of sort things out for them. I suppose the idea is that maybe they think the gay Christian would learn to love their heterosexual spouse even though they're not really attracted to them in that way. And I've heard disastrous and heartbreaking examples of when that's happened, and it's just not fair to either partner. So none of those options sound like really good options to me. So here's how I've been thinking about this biblically and theologically. And I've listened to some of the lectures and read some of the articles by those New Testament scholars and others who have challenged interpretations of the 6 or so places in the Bible that talk about same-sex relationships. Basically, they've argued that what is being condemned in those verses are things like rape and relationships with minors, ancient practices involving those that aren't examples of the kind of committed, mutual, loving, covenantal same-sex relationships that we're talking about today. And so their tactic has been to go by kind of verse by verse by verse, and basically to assert that these verses don't mean what you think that they mean, or they don't mean what the church is typically taught that they mean. Although I appreciate the research that's been done in that direction, and it's helped me to ask some new questions of those texts regarding a biblical or theological basis for full LGBTQ inclusion. I am drawn more to the chapter in Acts that Pastor William mentioned a few weeks ago, in Acts chapter 15, and to Acts chapter 10 as a kind of precedent. Remember, Acts chapter 15 details the early church controversy about whether or not male adult Gentile converts to Christianity, would need, as the Pharisees argued that they would, to get circumcised before they could join the church and become followers of Christ. Why did they think this? Well, remember, it's clear, Genesis 17:10 and 11. God clearly states, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." And then verse 14, "Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Even though Genesis is clear about this, the early church leaders decided in Acts 15 that adult male Gentile converts to Christianity would not need to get circumcised because it was too heavy of a burden, too much of an obstacle to place on adult male Gentiles who wanted to follow the way of Jesus. Similarly, in Acts chapter 10, Peter has this vision of this large sheet coming down from heaven with all kinds of four-footed creatures on it and reptiles and birds, all kind of animals that in God's law in the Old Testament, God had forbidden the people of God to eat. The voice tells Peter to kill and eat these animals. Peter's horrified and says in Acts chapter 10, verse 14, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." Verse 15, the voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." So whereas it was against God's law for Jews to eat certain foods and to eat with and associate with Gentiles around the table, God gave Peter a new revelation, which he then shared with other members of the early church in Acts chapter 11. Even though this was a new teaching that was entirely contrary to what they had known to be true previously, the early church, all of a sudden, now welcomed Gentiles into the fellowship and table fellowship with the early Christians. Eventually, most Christians decided that even though the Hebrew Bible forbids God's people from eating certain foods, that God was doing a new thing in their midst, and that moving forward, it would be okay for Christians to eat pork, for example. In other words, the thing that everyone just knew to be true for generations, that the children of the God of Israel did not eat pork or eat with Gentiles, God turned that former instruction upside down, and that moving forward, things would be different, and that would be okay. But remember, when these early Christians made these decisions, they did not have the book of Acts to guide them, right? They did not have the Bible the way that we have to guide them, right? They're making these decisions and walking in faith and walking in trust with the movement of the Spirit, with what's happening. They decided that whether you eat pork or don't eat pork, that should in no way be a barrier to full inclusion into the life of the church. So the question for us finally today is, in this generation, is God doing a similar kind of thing to what God did in Acts chapters 10 and 15, where the early church decided that the way they formerly interpreted certain passages of Scripture, circumcision in Genesis 17, the kosher food laws, that was no longer binding on them in the same way moving forward, because God was moving in a new way in their midst. Is God doing a similar kind of thing in this generation, stirring us to now recognize that requiring celibacy of our gay Christian brothers and sisters would be too heavy of a burden to bear, as was decided of circumcision in Acts 15? Is God doing a new thing in this generation? And if so, are we willing to walk in trust with God as God unfolds this new horizon in our midst? And are we willing to follow the fruit, that as we make decisions, we continue to listen to God's Spirit and discern and discuss the fruits of our decisions? Thank you all so much for listening.